Sorry, we were adjusting the schedule a little bit because we're going to have a little bit more class time and then get into a little bit earlier. We're going to do some extra things after. So anyway, I got all mixed up on the schedule. But what's new? I have no idea what's going on. So if you have your Bible, flip over to Acts chapter 17. We'll be picking up here. We'll try and keep this a little bit short. There's a lot that I want to get into, but we're just not going to have the time to get into everything the way that I want to. We have been going along Paul's missionary journeys, and we've seen quite a few places that he's been to, quite a few pit stops. And Paul, it's incredible the things that he's able to accomplish in a fairly short period of time. He's on these trips for several years. The first missionary journey is about 2 years, and he spends significant periods of time in the second and third missionary journeys. But this is something that he has really committed his life to, and it has taken a lot out of him, mentally and physically, and yet he keeps coming back, and he keeps on doing what he should be doing, even though it's often really difficult, and he's paid the price often in his own blood. And so in Acts chapter 17, we're skipping around a little bit, fast forwarding a little bit. Paul has gone to Macedonia. He's been to Philippi. He's been to Thessalonica. He's been to Berea. And then he finally has set sail down to Athens. And so he's going to pick up in kind of southern Greece, more southern Greece in Athens. So let's pick up, if you would, Acts chapter 17. Let's pick up verse 16. Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons and in marketplaces every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and his resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what these new teaching what this new teaching is that you're presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing of something new. So you got some interesting things that's going on here. So Paul does what Paul does, and he goes to the synagogue, and he reasons in the synagogue. I think that word reason is an interesting word. He's not just, giving a off-the-cuff speech. There's thought and strategy and logic that he's employing here. But he goes to the synagogue and he reasons with the Jews and the devout persons. Who might devout persons be in that? Why is there a distinction between Jews and devout persons? Yeah. These are those Gentile believers, proselytes. Proselytes would be considered Jews, but God-fearing Gentiles that were part of the Jewish synagogue, just not fully part of the Jewish synagogue. And so he goes, and as he has always done in all of these places, he goes to the synagogue first, reasons with them, and then he goes out into the marketplace, or your translation may say agora. And he goes there for a little while, and he starts to have some interesting interactions. These are some pictures from my trip to Athens. That foundation's right there that you can kind of see. It's kind of flat, not really a bird's eye view. That's probably the location of the Jewish synagogue in Athens. The whole region here, I'll show you the next picture, is the Roman agora, the ancient Roman agora. Greek agora, the marketplace. And so in that little section, they found a block with a carving of a menorah right there, that little candelabra-looking thing, which is a sure sign you've got Jews there, right? Because you got the candlesticks in the temple and all that kind of thing. And so it may be a later synagogue than the synagogue that Paul went to it probably is. But there's clear evidence that there was a synagogue in Athens, and pretty well positioned, right? They're downtown in the Agora, the big marketplace, where everybody from town is going to come there to do their shopping and get their stuff. And so they found a synagogue right there, which is pretty cool. This is what the Agora would have looked like around 150 AD there in the bottom. It's kind of a slanted. But where we were standing was kind of like right there-ish. So somewhere in that complex would be the synagogue. That is the Parthenon, which you've probably seen pictures of the Parthenon. It's the big temple to Athena. That right there is Mars Hill, right there. So like if you're standing right there, you got a really good view of the Parthenon, and you got a really good view of the Areopagus. So Paul's probably like right here around somewhere, and then he goes through the marketplace right here, and then he gets drug up here. So like, it's all a 5-minute walk from each other, just about. And so, notice the course of events. So he's there in the synagogue, then he goes out into the marketplace, the Agora, and then they drag him up to the Areopagus, and he delivers that speech to all the people. This is a kind of reconstruction of what it would have looked like, kind of 3D model of what it would have looked like. Same orientation there. This is just a shot of it. You got Mars Hill there on the top right, and then you got the Parthenon up there on the top left. And then, that's part of those columns of that, like, let me see, like that thing in the back right there. These are the columns of that stoa, which is just like a big porch place. And so, like, it's all really close. And these are some of the gods that Paul very likely could have, maybe would have seen. So these are statues of Aphrodite that date back to the 4th century BC. So, these were 500 years old when Paul was there, which is kind of crazy to consider. Just like the ability to carve out of pure marble, like folds in a skirt, is wild to me. Here's a interesting little relief of Hermes giving an infant Dionysus to nymphs of Pan, which is kind of interesting. And so Hermes is like the messenger god. That's the one that they think Paul is at that one occasion. And Dionysus is like the god of wine, and he's a like trickster god and all that kind of stuff. And so that's 300 years old when Paul goes by. He maybe has seen that. I don't know. These are some busts of Hermes, 6th through 5th century BC. So all of these things would be old by the time Paul got there, right? This is a statue of Nike or Nike. What does Nike mean, by the way? Yeah, victory, or just do it. But before that, it meant victory. And so you have this would have been a winged statue, which is kind of interesting. All statues of Nike have wings, but they're broken off over the years. And so that's the kind of thing that Paul would go through. Imagine that not broken and shattered, but like a part of full and complete and well cared for. And he goes through that little marketplace, and he sees hundreds of those things. We saw tons of them. I selectively chose ones without nudity for this slideshow. But there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And he goes through and he sees all of it, and he's disgusted. It's foolishness, right? You have these people that love wisdom, and they're gathered around, and that's what they like to do. They like to swap stories and hear something new. And Athens is the hotbed of Greek philosophy. Any of you guys ever take a philosophy class in school or anything like that? All right. What does the word philosophy mean? Do you know that? Love. Yeah, philo is love. and then Sophie is wisdom. And so philosophy is the love of wisdom. And so what you have in Athens, Athens is the birthplace of democracy, and Athens is the birthplace of a lot of philosophical movements. People like, you may not know what all they taught and all that kind of stuff, but you've probably heard the names, like Socrates and Plato, and those guys are from Athens. And so Athens has this enormous long history of people, philosophers that are trying to make sense out of life. And there's a whole bunch of different schools of philosophy that you can, buy into this and buy into that, and they offer different answers to the same problems. And they're trying to figure out, what does it mean to live a good life? And that's basically the core issue. There's two groups of philosophers here that are mentioned. Who are they? You got Epicureans and you got Stoics. What are those words? What is an Epicurean? You probably know that one a little bit less. What is a Stoic? When you think of Stoics today, people who are Stoic, what does that mean? Yeah, somebody who's firm, right? And in a lot of ways, we don't use the word stoic in the way that they would have used the word. But the whole philosophy of Stoicism is the world is chaotic and there's a lot of things I can't control, but I can control what I can control about myself, right? That's what I can control. And so the Stoics say you need to live a very virtuous life. You need to be very reasonable. You need to have good self-control over yourself. And regardless of what happens to you, you can achieve, and here's your fancy word for the day, ataraxia. It just means like, a place of tranquility is, the goal of all these guys. You can achieve tranquility if you are just a master of yourself. And so that's kind of a major school of thought. And there's a lot of Greeks that buy into this. And there's people that are willing to, it's kind of that whole mind over matter type stuff. It kind of stems from this. And so Paul is talking to people who are coming from that perspective of a very disciplined, very self-controlled style of life. And then you have like the flip opposite, which is the Epicureans. And the Epicureans say, you can have a good life is a life where you minimalize pain and you maximize pleasure. And so if it's going to cause you any form of discomfort, cut it out. And if it's going to cause you any form of pleasure, do it. Which you can imagine is a pretty hedonistic life, right? That is not very moral. And so you got all kinds of things there. Interesting, it's kind of funny. Whenever you read through stuff, things are typically named after the person that kind of came up with it. So Epicureanism came from a guy named Epicurus. Platonism came from Plato, that kind of thing. Stoicism came from a guy named Zeno. And the reason they're called Stoics, a stoa was like a big porch. The reason they're called Stoics is because Zenonians sounded weird. And so they're like, nah, we don't like that. Let's just call ourselves Stoics because we meet under this stoa. I won't tell the joke. There's a lot of jokes about, go to the stoa. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. Paul is talking with all these guys, and what they like to do, they like to sit around and they like to poke holes in each other's theories, right? And they like to argue, and they argue about, the little intricacies about life, and, what is life made of, and all these sorts of things. And they like to argue about all of that. And so Paul comes into this crowd of smart people that are talking about smart stuff, and he piques their interest. They want to say, well, tell us more about this. I'm interested in what you have to say. And so he does. They bring him up to the Areopagus. And this is a picture from the Areopagus. If you stand up on it, you can see, the Parthenon is just like looming over you, which is this enormous temple to Aphrodite. And You got a little smaller temple on the right to Nike, and you got all these different stuff. And so there's just kind of looming over you, and right underneath you, you have this marketplace where all these people would have been gathered. And what you probably would have had at this time on the Areopagus, you probably would have had like little booths set up, because it was like a place where people would do stuff. There were a bunch of like steps carved into it and all that kind of thing. And so in that picture before, you kind of can see it, maybe not quite. You kind of see that little lip right there. There's a little carved out platform that would have like stood over where the people would have like gathered. And so it's very possible Paul was like standing right there, maybe on a little platform on top of the rock or something like that, and talking to these people. There's a really pretty nice picture. There's a picture of the Areopagus from Mars Hill, which is, or Areopagus from the Parthenon. It's not that big a place. And so like you got right there is the agora stuff. So anyway, you have Paul then begins to talk to them. And he talks to them in a really interesting way. Pick up verse 22 through 23. We are going to run out of time. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." And so he stands up and he says, he begins to talk to them, these Greek philosophers, using Greek philosophy in their own language, literally and figuratively. And so there's some really interesting things, and we won't have time to break it down all the way, but when he says, "I perceive that you're very religious," is that a compliment or is that not a compliment? Yeah, it is not a compliment. And I don't think they would have understood it to have been a compliment. In Greek philosophy, you have this idea, there's a spectrum. On one end of it, you have, atheism, which is not belief in no gods like we think of it, but it's not enough belief in the gods. You don't give the gods enough respect. And then on the far end of the other spectrum, you have the word that Paul uses here, which is desidaimonia, or might be translated in some of your translations as superstitious, which is just like you're gullible. You got too much religion. You'll fall for anything. You don't believe. You're gullible. And so he's calling them gullible. And you want to be somewhere right in the middle, which is pious or Eusebius. And so Paul starts off by saying, "Listen, you guys are gullible. You're worshiping what you don't even know. And you're so afraid of offending these fake gods made of rock that you don't even know what you're worshiping." And he's pulling from, the language of Greek philosophy. He's using terminology that's very specific to Greek philosophy. There's a philosopher guy named Plutarch who wrote a whole big book about that very concept. And then he goes on, in the course of this, he quotes from two different Greek philosophers. He quotes from a guy named Epimenides of Crete and Aratus. And, "In him we live and move and have our being, for we indeed are his offspring." Those are quotes from Greek philosophers. So question, why and how does Paul know all of this stuff about Greek philosophy? Because that does not seem to me the type of thing that Gamaliel would have been teaching him in your Jewish school. How does he know all of this stuff? Yeah, he's probably doing his homework along the way, right? I really doubt that Paul spent a whole bunch of time growing up a Pharisee of Pharisees, a Hebrew of Hebrews. Right? I doubt he spent a whole lot of time reading the Greek plays. Probably not. That probably would have been looked down upon. But he's probably done his homework as he's been going these years in Greece, knowing the kinds of people that he's going to talk to. And so he's going to prepare himself to be able to relate to them so that they can speak on the same page. And so he talks to them in the language they understand, Greek philosophy. and his message is all about God. And so he says, "This I proclaim to you," verse 24, "the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man." And you can imagine, as he says that, look what's in the background, right? Right there. You can't miss it. And so God doesn't live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he has made from one man every living nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods, the boundaries of their dwelling places, that they should seek God, and that they should feel their way towards him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, and even as your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone or an image formed by the art of imagination of man. The time of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. So his message is God is a God who's near. He's not far off. He's not on some untouchable mountain. Probably not everybody was allowed just to go up and walk through the mountain or walk through the temple of Artemis or Athena up there on the Parthenon. You had a priesthood and you had like officials that could do that, but not your average Joe's not just wandering up there. It's this high off, lofty place. So God's not up on some mountain that you can't access. He's right here, and he wants you. He wants to be near you. And in fact, he's very near you. He says God's not a God who's impassionate about his creation. That's the Greek perception of the gods. They're fickle. They don't really care about people. They're kind of malicious. God's not like that. God cares about his creation, and he not only cares about them, but he sustains them and he gives them life. And he's the reason for your existence, and he doesn't just create you and ditch you. He's loved you, and he in fact sent his son for you. That's a novel idea. And then he says God is a God of justice. Where was that? He will judge the world in righteousness, or he'll judge the world with justice. Through a man whom he has appointed, Jesus. And so God is not a God who's going to overlook the problems of life. That's one of the big issues of Greek philosophy is, life is not what it should be. And so how do we deal with life when things aren't what they should be? He says, listen, God's a God who's just, and God's going to do what's right, and he's going to give reward to those that are righteous. He's going to punish those who are wicked. He's going to do what's right. And so after all of this, look at verse 32, and we'll start wrapping up. He says, "Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but some others said, 'We will hear you again about this.' So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them." And so a lot of lessons here. I think lesson number one, we got 2 minutes, we got to go fast. Paul meets people where they are. There's a lot of challenges in the world, and people have very different perspectives. People have come from a whole lot of different backgrounds. But time and time again, we've talked about this week, is that Paul, becomes all things to all people so that he might win some. And I think that's exactly what you see here. I don't think Paul was naturally inclined to speak in terms of Greek philosophy. I think he's a lot more comfortable talking about the Old Testament. But he's going to talk about Greek philosophy when people need to hear about Greek philosophy. And so he meets people where they are. I think it's also really important is that you can't engage with people that are steeped in a culture unless you understand that culture. If somebody is... We think about it in terms of like foreign missions, right? If you go from here to Japan and you try and, teach people and you act exclusively like an American Southerner, are you going to be effective in Japan? Not a chance, right? They have a very different culture, and they have customs, and they have, ways of speaking, and they've got, there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into it. And if you want to be effective in reaching out to people from a different culture, then you have to understand that culture. And to the same extent, that's true of us today. We are often living in a different culture than you grew up in. And if you want to be effective in our current day culture in the United States, it's not just a foreign missions thing, it's a domestic missions thing. If you want to be effective in the culture here and now, you have to understand the culture here and now. It doesn't mean that you give in to its problems. Paul's certainly not given in to their problems with idolatry, but he does understand where they're coming from. And he speaks to them in a way that is respecting that heritage that they've got. And then boldness is necessary. He knew he's going to be mistreated, and he was mistreated here and other times. But he knew that at the same time, some people would believe, and some people would respond. And so he was willing to suffer the wrong so that others might believe. All right, we're out of time. Thank you, guys.